IVM.
Informally, suggestions have been made by the United States that China should be taken into the United Nations, but not in the Security Council, and that India should take her place in the Security Council. We cannot, of course, accept this, as it means falling out with China, and it would be very unfair for a great country like China not to be in the Security Council. We have, therefore, made it clear to those who suggested this that we cannot agree to this suggestion. We have even gone a little further and said that India is not anxious to enter the Security Council at this stage, even though, as a great country, she ought to be there. The first step to be taken is for China to take her rightful place, and then the question of India might be considered separately. Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week, I tackle important questions and themes in international relations, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. What you heard at the beginning of this episode is a note penned by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1955. This is relevant because India has long been pushing for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, or the UNSC. The current External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, once suggested that the UNSC required better representation and, quote-unquote, a refresh button. He says, and I quote, "For obvious reasons, we tend to equate multilateralism with the United Nations. The problem we have today at the narrow level of the leadership of the United Nations is a challenge to its credibility and to its effectiveness." End quote. India has long been concentrating its efforts on playing a large role on the global stage. In 2021, India won its 8th UNSC term when it secured 184 of the 192 votes cast. So for the next 2 years, India will be a non-permanent member, along with Norway, Mexico, Ireland, and Kenya. But many people within India like to point out that, like in 1955, Nehru squandered opportunities to be a big player on the world stage. So, was India really offered a permanent seat in the UNSC? Did Nehru really give up a realpolitik move for an idealist imagination of the world? And what does that mean for us today? These are big questions, and we'll have to dig into history to answer them. My guest for today has done just that. Dr. Anton Harder is a teaching fellow at the London School of Economics. Anton spent 10 years living and working in China and then did his PhD on Sino-Indian relations between 1949 and 1962. We're going to hear from Anton, but first, a short break to hear from IVM podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another very special week on the IVM Podcast Network. Before I get to that, let me quickly thank our sponsors on the network this week. Storytel, thewholetruthfoods.com, and we have a new sponsor in Syed. Thank you all so much for being part of the network. So, this is Valentine's week, and we have a bunch of stuff for you guys. So I'm going to give you a couple of episodes that you could definitely catch up with. Agla Station, Season 2, Episode 12, Be Our Valentine. Ritasha and Ayushi have a little bit of talk about love and all the rest of the stuff that goes wrong with that. On The Habit Coach, Episode 396, Ashton Doctor did an episode which went into the much-debated origins of Valentine's Day. Also, do check out Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan featuring Govinda and his wife Sunita Ahuja. He talks to them about amazing 33 years together. But you know what, folks? If you want to hear more about these Valentine's Day things, what I suggest is go to our webpage, ivmpodcast.com/blog. And on the blog, we're going to post a bunch of different playlists that we've created for all the various major services. So if you're feeling in the mood for love, do check that out. You'll definitely enjoy it. Just a quick note on a few other noteworthy episodes this week. Nankari Kunal Vijayakar was the guest. They spoke about street food with him. On Simplified, they talk about vaccinating 1 billion people, then the logistical and administrative task in front of us. And on the Wire Talk, Siddharth talks to Devdutt Mukhopadhyay about the human cost of internet shutdowns. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Hi, Anton. Welcome to States of Anarchy. We're really glad that you could join us today.
Hi, Hamsini. Thank you very much for having me. This should be fun. I look forward to it.
So do I. I was going through some of your writing and I read through your PhD thesis as well. And I thought it was very interesting. Yes.
That probably, it might not double. At least 2 or 3 people have read it already, I know, but certainly that's going to make a big impact on the... thank you for doing that.
No worries. And I found it really interesting because I think you're one of the few people who've maybe spent time in the Chinese archives going through stuff that was written about India and China in the 1950s. So how was that experience for you? How was working with the Chinese archives?
Well, it was a lot of fun and kind of a privilege as well, for various reasons. One, it's just a privilege. You're sitting there with history scrolling in front of your eyes as you sit at the kind of, the computer screen in which it's all digitized. All of their diplomatic files are digitized. So that's, of course, amazing. And when you see even handwritten notes by those great figures, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, people like that, and then you can't help but feel, right, the kind of the weight of that history. And so that's a privilege. It's also a privilege because those archives specifically, and archives generally across China now, are not as open as they were when I was kind of doing my PhD research. So I actually first went into those archives, the Foreign Ministry archives of the PRC, in about 2009. And the reason being I was doing a master's, and I did a little bit of research in Sino-Indian relations then. And it was very open and easy to use then. You could print anything you wanted without any limits. The only difficulty was that the facilities were a little old-fashioned. There was just, I think, a small number of terminals, and it was a bit of a crush each morning and after lunch to reclaim a terminal. So I ended up taking a packed lunch because you were sort of kicked out after 3 hours for lunch. And then rather than going to to eat somewhere, I would have a packed lunch and eat in the corridor in order that I could be back at the front of the queue but by the time I started doing my PhD, they'd shifted to a very sort of lovely modern facility with lots of terminals that were never at capacity. But and this was in about, so that the master's research, the trip in there was sort of around 2009. And I guess around 2012, 13 or so was when I first started doing some research as a PhD student in those archives and found this lovely new facility. But from that time and through the course of my PhD, the restrictions on using that archive grew and grew, so that whereas once you could print anything, look at anything, the only thing you couldn't print back then was something that had the actual handwriting of Mao or Zhou on it. So that's a small restriction. But by the time, halfway through my PhD, the restrictions had grown so that you couldn't print anything. You couldn't request a copy of anything. All you could do was transcribe what you saw on the screen, which for someone who is reading Chinese as you're not a native, that presents also, difficulties. So it became a real kind of very much a physical labor to extract material from the archive. But I continued to find interesting stuff, so it was worth it right up until I didn't know this was coming. But one morning I turned up at the archive and there was a bike lock through the door, through the door handles. And it was simply shut and it didn't reopen again for a few years. And there was all sorts of rumors about why this had happened. One being there was apparently a Japanese historian who'd found a document which somehow contradicted the official line on various maritime territorial claims, all the disputes now in the South China Sea, things like that. The official line was it was shut for sort of upgrading the software and things like that. But it has reopened, but it's reopened. I haven't been back since, but lots of people have. And the report is that now when you search for, if you put in the United States into the search box, 10% of what used to be there will come up on the list of, what's found, the list of documents that are available. So there's generally been a kind of, it seems as if there's been some kind of removal of files. So it's not the resource it once was, although some people have still written some interesting things based on what is there. There was a really very useful article, I can't remember which journal it's in, but Julia Lovell, who's a great historian of China, wrote an interesting article on the kind of the management of foreign visitors to the PRC in the 1950s. So the sort of the protocol and the etiquette and that kind of thing, which is this often when I was working in the archives, I would see that sort of thing and ignore it and want to go on to the juice, the diplomatic correspondence but so there is, anyone who's listening to this thinking, oh, what can I do? There is stuff there you could make use of. So don't be entirely discouraged. But it is not what it was in any way, shape or form, which is a real shame, but does give me this sense of having had a privileged access to that archive when I did. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it certainly gives me hope. How was it different working with the Indian archives as compared to the Chinese ones?
So the Indian archives also have their challenges. Let's say when at least I did the PhD, the two main archives I used in India were in Delhi, and it was the National Archives, as you might imagine, and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library archive. So they are both open and staffed by very friendly people, but there are still restrictions. So the Nehru one, until quite recently, there were certain papers that were off limits. So, for instance, the Nehru Museum holds the private papers of all sorts of, the major figures of India's 20th century. So, if you're doing diplomatic history, there's, all the Subimal Dutt, and all of these sorts of figures. But the Nehru papers have been off limits until very recently. I'm not exactly sure what the liberalisation there has been, but people are saying now those are available. I believe the Krishna Menon papers are still off limits. The archive there, it's not all digitized. You get the actual documents in your hand, which is always fun as a historian. And you can request anything except for those one or two collections that are off limits. The problem is that there is an inconvenience, which is you are only allowed to copy, and you can request photocopies of about 25% of any file. So, that is a limitation, but again, you can get around it. You can get some from that file, some from that file. You can still build up a picture, but that's the limitation. And it is frustrating. I don't entirely, I have to say, understand it. What difference does it make? I think there's an oversensitivity there, which doesn't really serve, what is the archive or whoever made that rule trying to hide? I mean, there's nothing, it seems to me there isn't really anything to hide. The National Archive is similar in that there is a rule about how much that can be copied. I've found the National Archive slightly less easy to use. I think they often you make requests for documents to be transferred. It might be related to the stuff that I look at. I'm looking at relations with China in a sensitive period. And as a result of that, I'm also looking at policy towards the kind of the border regions, the Himalayan states, stuff like that. So I've found the National Archive to be less useful, and it might be related to my topic. There's never any explanation for why files aren't transferred. I suspect sometimes it's because files can't be found, but it might be also that, there's a sensitivity as well. But at both of those archives, I enjoy working there. It's always fun, and you can get a good lunch at the Nehru one and the National Archives. Actually, there's a chai stall outside the National Archives as well, which is quite good. If you can put up with am I right in saying there are monkeys who run around there? They might threaten your lunch if you look away.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, along with the book recommendations, we should start adding meal recommendations. If you're going to the Chinese archives, there is a small place right opposite.
There is a website that does that. I'm trying to remember its name now. Where people post little make blog posts about using certain archives, and people tend to include in that, local eating options.
I will track that down. But getting sort of to the topic at hand, do you want to talk a little bit about your research first? What were you researching about China and India relations in a sensitive period?
Well, I guess the idea was, this. If you look at China and India back in the early Cold War, what dominates is the 1962 war, which is called a border war, and is often also related to tensions between them over Tibet. Of course, the border on one side on both sides is alongside Tibet, so Tibet is a key part. But I guess my initial motive for exploring this topic more was what else is going on? There's, of course, a war in 62, but what were the relations between China and India in the 1950s? Problem with an event like a war is that then people tend to look at the preceding history in, historians use the word teleological, meaning that we kind of see, or sometimes historical narratives can portray things as having been on an inevitable course, and everything that went before in the 1950s was leading up to this eventual war. So that was one thing I wanted to explore, that what was the reality of Sino-Indian relations earlier. Of course, that can help us explain why then the war happened, but maybe the war happened simply because of events in the months preceding it, nothing to do with, the longer history. So that was one thing. And then, part of that also is just what else was going on beyond the border dispute and beyond Tibet, which clearly was an important part of the relationship. But these are two huge, of course, they're the mega states, right, of Asia and the world. And their importance lies way beyond simple territorial wrangling. And their future relationship does also, of course. So let's have a look at other ways in which they interacted and see what we can find out. So that was the kind of what led me in a not a particularly academic way, just a sort of a sense that that's what I would like to explore. So I have a background as an undergraduate. I studied Chinese language and history, things like that. I'd lived quite a long time in China. I read the language and things. India was a bit of a sort of it was a new thing to some extent for me. But the PhD research was also about wanting to explore India as well. And so this was the obvious topic that combined the two parts of the world that I have this sort of particular interest in. I grew up kind of reading Indian comic books, but kind of by chance, simply because my mum, for her work, used to go to India a lot and would bring back these. I can never say the name properly, but you'll know what I mean. The Amar Chitra Katha.
Yeah, the Amar Chitra Katha.
yeah, all of those. So these were always brought back in suitcases by my mum, and so I but then I never really did anything about India as I went to university and afterwards. But then the PhD gave me a chance to really engage with India. So that's been something I've enjoyed a great deal.
That's really fascinating. I think I agree with you, particularly with the 1962 war. Historians have a lot of, I think, what's called the confirmation bias, where they say, of course, it was leading up to the war. There was no sort of other inevitable outcome to this. And I think that what's nice about it is that now there's a lot of work that's being done on this particular period of the 1950s that's sort of recasting the relationship in a new light.
Well, I saw you had an interview with Arnab Ghosh, right, on his book on statistics in the PRC, but he looks a great deal and he's very interested in, relations between India and China, in a completely leaving the territorial stuff and the high politics perhaps away. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I do too. Which will sort of bring me back to sort of the high politics of it all. This year India has been very proud of the fact that it's become a non-permanent member of the UNSC, and it always takes me back to this sort of unknown period of history for the general public, where people didn't know that India was offered a permanent seat at the UNSC sort of right at the beginning. So could you take us back to sort of the 1940s and tell us a little bit about what was happening with the United Nations Security Council and sort of the politics of that?
Well, the origins of this, of course, lie in the war. And in a way, even the term United Nations does not quite mean what we think of it as meaning today, because actually it's the Allies. That excludes some people, to an extent. I mean, and the UN, I guess if you go back to the Atlantic Charter in 1941, this sort of vague agreement, there's no specific document here, but a sort of an agreement between the Americans and the British about what the world should look like, post-war world. But even then, the Americans weren't yet in the war, but they're looking forward to this potentially happening. But at the same time, in that year, the British had gone into an alliance with the Soviets. They'd now been invaded by the Nazis. And shortly after the Atlantic Agreement, you get other allied powers kind of signing up to this agenda, this post-war agenda that's envisaged. And the Soviets join that as well. And then, of course, the US is supporting Britain a great deal already at this point in the war. And then, in the end of 1941, it joins the war after Japan attacks it. So that's what it sort of begins as, the UN, the United Nations. It's the wartime allies. Interestingly, there are efforts made at this point to assure the Axis powers, right, the Germans and Italians, then the Japanese, that this kind of vision of the post-war world, which does talk about eliminating the sources of war, so poverty, we need to get development, things like that, but also one aspect of the Atlantic Charter and then the United Nations is support for self-determination. So the suppression of that is thought to be a cause of war. So assurances are offered to the Germans and the Italians, the people, not the regimes in place then, saying that, in a post-war world, you will not suffer a punitive peace, which is what happened in World War I, right? The Versailles Treaty put this great burden on Germany and the defeated powers, which is often said to have led to the subsequent war. So you won't suffer a punitive peace. It will be a different kind of peace, one where there's a kind of a collective commitment to global security and development, things like that. So that's where the kind of ideas that lie behind the United Nations and the offer being held out there to the Axis powers, you will be brought into this once your regimes are got rid of. So that's all well and good. Interestingly, the thorn in this for some participants, so a key actor here, like the British. Now, the British are uneasy about this self-determination talk. So I'm doing it. This is a podcast, an Indian podcast. It's relevant here, right? The British didn't see self-determination, of course, as this is where they differed with the Americans. The British didn't see World War II as being about ending the British Empire. Self-determination is more, for those occupied areas of Europe. And of course, that would be a problem. And the US saw itself as an anti-colonial power. So, there was this difference between those original UN actors. And they thought about, in terms of a Security Council, there's an idea, and Roosevelt talked about this during the war, that you needed at the top of this UN body the major powers who would basically take charge of world security. And the term the four policemen was used. And you might say four, right? There are five powers in the security, permanent members of the Security Council. So this was the British and the Americans and the Soviets, but also the Republic of China, which was an important wartime ally. It was absorbing a great deal of Japanese military strength just by holding up the Japanese in, the quagmire that they found themselves in, perhaps in China, was a huge contribution to the war. They didn't necessarily see the Republic of China as functioning as a future policeman of the world with great heft. But, this is partly to keep your wartime ally sweet, right? You've got to offer them that, make it clear they're valued. So the Republic of China was there. And then France, of course, fully occupied. And there's a collaborationist Vichy regime, and de Gaulle is in exile in London. But he is also told that you will be the fifth member. And I'm sure Churchill and Roosevelt didn't think that France was capable of being one of the world's policemen either. but there were, I suppose, political reasons for. De Gaulle was a man with a great sense of personal and Gallic pride, and it wasn't a great loss to include him, perhaps, as well. So anyway, that's the kind of the where those permanent members came from. The problem with all of this, because of course there was a great deal of cooperation with the Soviets during the war, and they made a colossal contribution, of course, lost more men and civilians than anyone else in the war, and so have a kind of a historic right to that kind of leading position. But the problem was that after the war, with the Nazis gone, of course, relations between those powers, between the UK and particularly, of course, America and the Soviets, as we all know, it quickly kind of falls apart, and you see this sort of Cold War atmosphere taking hold. And so the UN Security Council perhaps doesn't function as it was thought it might do. It very quickly becomes a zone of kind of Cold War contestation and, in fact, sort of deadlock. But what really perhaps undermines the potential for the UN Security Council to function well, or as it was sort of originally intended, is the way in which the Cold War then spreads from Europe to Asia. And this happens, it's already becoming, perhaps even, in 1948, it's becoming clear the communists in the civil war in China, the Chinese Civil War, are actually starting to overcome the Republic of China and the nationalists. And by, towards the end of 1949, October 1949, the communists do then set up a state and the People's Republic of China. And this is a great shock to the Americans. This discourse of the loss of China takes hold, and there's all sorts of ramifications from that. But for the UN and the UN Security Council, of course, the issue is, now you have, by a certain logic, you have the potential for a second communist state, one in the kind of brewing McCarthy kind of atmosphere of Washington, a communist state, the Chinese communist state that is deemed to be part of the great communist monolith, simply taking orders from Moscow, and now they're going to join the UN Security Council as well, or you might think that they would do. Well, that cannot happen. This is an illegitimate bunch of communist guerrillas. There's no way, the legitimate government has exiled itself on Taiwan. We will continue to back them. But this becomes an awful great dispute, with the Soviets shouting ever louder that this is an outrage, and business therefore kind of failing to take place at the Security Council. And where this really, a good example of this is when in the middle of 1950 and the Korean conflict begins. So the North basically moved their troops into South Korea, and things, all hell breaks loose on the Korean Peninsula. And this is then debated in the UN, but the Soviets rather perhaps short-sightedly absented themselves from those debates in protest at the PRC being refused its rightful Chinese seat on the Security Council. And so therefore the US was able to, with no Soviet veto power, which is the special privilege of those permanent members, the US is able to get various resolutions through calling for military action in Korea. So it's actually a moment where the UN Security Council kind of does function, but it's functioning only because it's dysfunctional and one member isn't there. But anyway, that's what's sort of going on, and the way in which, the expansion of the Cold War sort of undermined the way in which this body had been envisioned at its outset.
Yeah, I think that's very fascinating because on one hand, you're sort of emerging from World War II. On the other hand, you have all of these rapidly decolonizing countries. The US is worried about the spread of communism across the world. And I guess at this point, only the US and the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons. Everyone got them a little later, perhaps. And so sort of the dynamics of the Security Council are very interesting. And was there talk of reform of the Security Council at that point in time?
Well, there was a debate, of course, over China and what should be done. I mean, it's interesting to look back. Even in 1945, there were some who argued, look, this was as the body was being finalised. Some said it's a bad idea to give this veto power to these 5 members. It gives them a dominance which is going to be destructive and perhaps obstructive. A preponderant power that, it's like you can see this is undemocratic in a way. If you want a body, a lot of the rhetoric of the UN Charter, the Atlantic Charter and the UN Charter then subsequently was quite democratic. So the idea that one big power could simply block, any UN agenda that's put forth at the Security Council was objected to back then. But I guess this was voted on, and the sense was, I think, that if you want those great powers included, then they've got to be given that reassurance that they can protect their own interests. So, at its birth, the UN was kind of compromised in that way. But you've got to go back to history and think perhaps, the US, of course, famously didn't join the League of Nations, and why would a great power subject itself to such limits if it didn't feel it had to? So there has to be an element of pragmatism. As to whether there was continuous calls for reform, by the late 1940s, I'm not exactly sure what agendas were there. I think the issue of China came to dominate quite quickly. Of course, there hadn't been that much decolonization by this stage. There were, of course, South Asia was where there'd been a great wave of, obviously decolonization there. There was more to come. So I think that kind of the head of steam building for a kind of representation from the third world as it was then, or the newly independent states would grow over time. It didn't seem to be something that was on the immediate agenda in India at this point, at least in the government. I'm sure there would have been people talking about this, though, outside of government. I mean, no doubt, but it's the details of that I'm not too sure of.
Yes, of course, I understand that. And so against this backdrop, when I was reading sort of some of your work about the United States and the USSR offering India a seat at the table, it was very intriguing for me to see why these powers would do that, particularly considering India at that point in time. America and India weren't sort of on the best foot because I think Nehru was, the great socialist, and he imagined himself as sort of the leader of this large third world country. And so why do you think America made that offer to India to join the UNSC as a permanent member?
So, if we want to talk about this idea of offers being made to India for a seat on the as a permanent member of the Security Council, then I think we need to deal with this word offer. What is on offer? Let's think of that. Because I know that this is an issue that's debated and rowed about in India today. People sort of bring this up and say, this buffoon. That's not my language, but people talk about Nehru in that sort of way and say, what is he doing, turning down a kind of an offer to join the, and obviously this is something India is pursuing today, right? India, for some time, has been arguing with great, justice, I would say, for a seat on the Security Council today. So what is this guy doing, turning down an offer back in the 50s? Why on earth would you do that? Well, you have to ask, what did this offer really mean? Was it an offer? Was it actually realistic? Was this a seat presented to Nehru on the Security Council, wrapped up with a ribbon, there, put in front of him, seat yourself down, job done? No, it wasn't like that. And so I think it's unhelpful to think of it like that, because then it becomes very easy to say, what is this guy doing, turning this down? it's so obviously in India's national interest to take that. But what was the nature of these offers, right? Because you mentioned the Soviets as well. The Soviets made an offer sorry, I'm using the term, but I qualify it in that way. So if everyone could pay attention to that, I think it's important. So the Soviet kind of probing occurred in 1955, and this US kind of discussion was in 1950. That's the first thing. Was this real? In the sense of if Nehru had said, yes, please, can I have a seat on the UN Security Council? What would have happened then? Would he, the following week have had, his bottom down on the chair in the chamber? I don't think so. One very simple thing being, it's all right for the US to say, not one of the permanent members has the authority to just offer and grant a seat, right? The other members have veto powers. And in a Cold War context, whatever the Americans propose, the Soviets are going to, reject. And likewise in 1955, whatever the Soviets propose, the Americans will reject. Nehru knew this. Nehru knew also that the US offer was taking place in a particular context just after the Korean War had begun as a local war. It would, of course, then develop by the end of the year, as he feared it would, into a larger... It didn't turn into exactly, I guess it does not quite a global war, but an international war. But he was aware that the US was essentially trying to drive a wedge between him or India and China, and he was very wary of that. Yeah.
I think, that makes me wonder, so were these offers just lip service in that sense? If we're saying what were these offers, were they just were they bait to see if India would sort of take it and put, I guess, like national interest first, or was that it?
Well, so I think it's a kind of probing. So what happened is that, or as far as we know, and I talk about this in my paper, right, there's this paper at the Wilson Center where I look at this exchange of letters between Mrs. Pandit, right, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Nehru's sister, who's there in New York, and she writes back to Nehru to say, I've had an approach by the State Department. She uses the term, something's being cooked up, which immediately indicates her own skepticism about this. Something's being cooked up. She's approached by Americans with this scheme for perhaps trying to get India in the place of basically taking China's seat. So that seat was currently held by the Republic of China. So the idea was boot them out because they're a busted flush. Don't give it to the communists, and let's see if India can go in. So that's the kind of what they're saying. And apparently Pandit is also told, the American press, important editors, right, in the American press are kind of being told about this, and we could get a public opinion campaign going, a sense going in America that this is something that we should be doing. So, Nehru writes back, this is just ridiculous. We can't countenance it. Of course, India is a great country. Let's mention this. Of course, India is a great country and deserves a seat there. But he makes it very clear that the priority has to be sorting out this issue of China's representation. He doesn't want China turfed out. China was an important player in World War II. It's an important player now. But what he thinks needs to happen is, look, let's be realistic. The communist Chinese, whatever you might think of communists, and Nehru was not, pro-communist. He was, even to call him a socialist, I think is problematic. But nevertheless, there they are. The CCP, the Communist Party of China, have created a state. It's a state that seems to has credibility. It seems to have the support of a decent majority of its people. They're in control. The Jiang Jieshi on Taiwan doesn't look like he's going to be coming back in unless the Americans nuke the communists and Chiang Kai-shek is able to lead an army back in. But who the hell wants that? That's what Nehru is trying to avoid. So he says, listen, you need to treat this new regime in China seriously, and that means grant them that Chinese seat. Don't make the error that the West made back in 1917, after the Russian Revolution. The West immediately tried to confront them and isolated them and created this kind of this confrontation, which the consequences are still before us today, as in Nehru's mind. Let's not isolate the Chinese communists. Let's give them their dues, bring them into the UN Security Council as a kind of a stakeholder, right? This term is used today as well in some quarters about, or it has been over the last 10 years, with how to deal with a rising China. But Nehru had a similar kind of idea. Treat them respectfully, bring them in, and this guarantees the legitimacy of the UN, a body that's vital for international security and international development. We can deal with India later. But let's not make the UN situation worse now. Let's get the UN functioning as it was meant to be. And that means bringing in the Chinese communists. And by the way, when I say that he wasn't sort of pro-communist, he wasn't either a socialist specifically, there was also a kind of sense, it's worth thinking about this, in many quarters, and not just within India, that the Chinese communists were more nationalist than they were communist. And this might have been it turns out this is a misconception, perhaps, because we don't want to assume that the Chinese Communist Party, its radical turn in the late 50s, was inevitable. But nevertheless, there was this sense in 1949, 1950, as the Chinese communists took power and established their state, that this might be, it's a kind of, it comes from an agrarian movement. Sure, they're doing land reform. But so are other parts of the world. It's not just communists who are doing land reform. The Indians talked about land reform. Even on Taiwan, they now did land reform. So it doesn't make you a communist. So there was also a sense that, amongst, I think, Asian political leaders like Nehru were more willing to grant a nationalist sentiment to the Chinese and say, they're not blindly following the Soviets. If they join the Security Council as they should, they will not just follow orders from Moscow. We expect them to act as a great Asian power. Now, that's just another element to Nehru's kind of attitude, that we need to be respectful and allow the Chinese communists to take this seat. And by the way, that links to his own sense of Asia's resurgence with the end of the war and decolonization coming across South Asia, and movements for, decolonization building all around the world. Nehru believed that the establishment of this kind of quite impressive-looking regime in Beijing added to this sense that Asia was on the march, and Asia should be treated respectfully. So let's dispense with this running dog, to use the kind of the terminology, not Indian terminology, but the communists, but others use this terminology about Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, a man who, some would portray him as sort of craven towards the Americans. Let's have a self-respecting Asian actor, the Chinese communists, integrated into the international system, and it will be better for the world and better for Asia. So there's something, another thing. Very often this issue, I think, in India, people look back at it and think, okay, we had a war with these people. They betrayed us. We offered friendship and they betrayed us. And so they're traitors. And yet we didn't take this UN seat out of some kind of sympathy for China. But, they didn't know then how things would pan out. This is this thing of not reading history backwards. Nehru had an agenda for, not to say Pan-Asianism, but he had a sympathy for Asian renewal, and his policy towards China was part of that. It was part of a respect for India's own independence, to treat China respectfully. I think that's the point. It's almost an element of his own nationalism and love of his own country, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is something that comes up with Nehru's foreign policy, not only towards China, but towards domestic policy, towards international policy. Was this man an idealist? Was he a realist? Was he a pragmatist? Was he just stupid, or did he have a grand plan in mind? Was he completely deluded about the world? Or did he really understand sort of the political forces that were at play? And I think these are discussions people have very heatedly in India till date about whether Nehru saved the country or destroyed it completely. And I think often history doesn't make those broad, sweeping statements, right?
How, how did he? I'm a little curious if I could throw a question, but how did he destroy the country? What is the argument? Is it to do with sort of putting in planning, a planning economy, sort of socialist policies, things like it's that kind of stuff, I guess, which people.
Yeah, so I've heard him lambasted from people on all sides of the political spectrum. Yeah. So, people on the left say, oh, he didn't do reform, like he didn't do enough reform.
Yeah.
The First Amendment to the Constitution was to do away with all of the land reorganization that people desperately wanted. Whereas people who are more liberal claim that, the planned economy really destroyed India. And so he gets a lot of hate from everybody around, which is unfortunate because I think he was a really good statesman who was handling a very difficult period in history. And I can't think of, I guess, most people doing better if they were in history.
I think India was very lucky to have him at that point. My God, did India inherit problems, and have a sober man like that at the helm was a blessing to, so I now reveal myself as being slightly kind of more sympathetic to Nehru than I know some of his detractors. But no, I think, you think of how the way in which independence emerged, this unprecedented crisis, then, and, other things like, planning was in the so-called socialist economy. Well, planning was fairly. It wasn't just a kind of a Soviet thing. There was this fairly widespread consensus that planning was the modern way to organize a national economy. Even in the West, even the so-called capitalist parts of the world took that seriously.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think I have extremely high regard for Nehru. In that sense, I'll also betray my own biases in that sense. I think there's also a lot about how that period is looked back, particularly with relations to the 1962 war. I think there's still a sense of betrayal and national shame that India really hasn't recovered from with the 1962 war. And there's this image of, Nehru was once this man who championed the rights of a lot of people, and in the end he died this broken-hearted man just immediately after the war was over. It's a very Bollywood kind of plot line. But I think it's one that a lot of people sort of identify with.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't die immediately afterwards. It was 1964, of course. But yes, I mean, it did age him and seemed to suck the vitality from him. But interestingly, it didn't. I don't think it affected his sense that he had taken the right approach. And again, Pundit is useful here. You see her talking about the fact that we will stick with non-alignment. It is the correct path, because for them, non-alignment wasn't. And it's interesting, this question of was Nehru a realist or an idealist? It does seem the debate over him is so. It kind of swirls around that simple question. And non-alignment can be portrayed very easily as this, idealist position. And the war is used particularly to highlight that this idealist came up against these people with this sense of hard power, and he lost. But there is a realist logic to Nehru as well. And you can see this in the question of the UN, to go back to the UN and the Security Council. Because Nehru, and this is very interesting, an Indian scholar I think he's based in Delhi, Nabaran Roy, wrote an article kind of almost sort of responding to my Wilson Centre article on exactly this issue of these so-called offers. And he sort of develops and sort of draws attention to an aspect of it that I hadn't really emphasised so much, which is that Nehru's attitude to the UN actually shows that he does have this sense of realist power, and that he accepts that there should be a Security Council with with permanent members with veto rights. He believed it was realistic and pragmatic that great powers had some special privilege, because what are you going to do otherwise? You want those great powers rampaging outside of the international system, doing, acting willy-nilly in their own interests. Well, let's get serious. Let's not be naive idealists about this, and acknowledge that the great powers need inducements and need reassurance, and draw them in. And so that logic, so he accepts the whole notion of veto power for the great powers. And he says, for that same reason, the PRC has to be there. This is realistic. It's not some idealistic notion of being sympathetic to communists. It's a recognition of the hard power that they control and their ability to disrupt the region and the world, even if their rights are not accommodated.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that article, and I guess there is a realist line in that sense, which would say it was, I guess, in India's national interest to have a strong UN without it than a weak UN with it, particularly as a weak new country. You'd want sort of a stable world order so that you're not sucked into more conflict.
And that's exactly, one of the reasons I think Nehru rejects this whole idea, because for India to be involved in either unseating China at the UN Security Council or even coming in, as the Soviets kind of suggested, as a sixth member, would involve so much kind of uproar that it would, certainly the US offer, as such as it was, would, and he put this in a letter, that it might lead to the Soviets even finally quitting it. The phrase was something like that, which showed you at that point, and as historians, we must zero in on what was going on at that point. There was great discord in the UN. It wasn't working properly. The Soviets had absented themselves. Nehru feared them actually quitting it for good, if this China issue wasn't solved. And then which is essentially what the US were trying to do with this probing of Nehru. Maybe we could make you our accomplice here, announce that we'll back you, saying let's put India in there instead of China. That's not actually going to happen. All that will happen is a great big propaganda campaign in the US saying this is what should happen. Democratic India, representing the rights of the newly decolonizing world, will come and take an honourable seat at the UN Security Council and continue its good work with us to contain communists around the world. And, so that would be the propaganda in America. And then the Soviets would respond saying India is lining up with the imperialist capitalists, overturning the legal rights of the People's Republic of China to the Chinese seat. India has revealed itself as a two-faced, tool
of capitalism.
Tool of capitalism. A stooge is the word, right, that the Chinese used about Nehru early on, right? I think even still during the Civil War, when they saw him as simply, placed in independent India by the British. So that's what would happen. That would actually be the result of Nehru saying to Pundit, yes, tell the Americans, let's do it. We want a seat on the UN Security Council. That wouldn't happen. You wouldn't get the seat. What would happen would be this God almighty global propaganda battle over what the Security Council should look like. It would intensify the Cold War. It would make any possibility of settling the Korean conflict worse. It would make the possibility of settling, brewing conflicts elsewhere in the world worse. And it would make India look as if it was not even-handed in the Cold War. The Chinese and the Soviets would think of it as just a stooge. And what Nehru could not abide, that in his sense, this great power, India, a great power with as much history behind it and glory as any other of the great powers, could be viewed as anything other than independent. He hadn't fought he hadn't been imprisoned for decades to have that, right? That did not accord with his sense of India's grandeur. And that's why I don't understand, sometimes the criticisms of him by people today on this kind of patriotic grounds and things. This was a profoundly patriotic man who perhaps was sometimes, as we can all be, love of things and our country can colour our views of things sometimes, but you can't fault him for his love of India.
I completely agree. And, that makes me wonder, how was the USSR's, let's not call it offer, approach or suggestion to India joining the UNSC in 1955 different from what the Americans were suggesting?
Yeah, so first of all, it's different in that the idea here seemed to be that India would be a sixth member of the UN, permanent member of the UN Security Council. That seemed to be what Bulganin, who sort of proposed this to Nehru, that seemed to be the idea. But I actually think that this offer was even more feeble than the US one. The US, if the Indians had latched onto this, the US would have made something of it. It would have been part of their propaganda and everyone would have known about it. But the Soviets, and Nehru realized this, the Soviets were not in a position to, by this stage, Indian relations with the US weren't so bad in 1950, but they were a lot worse by 1955. And if, there's no way that the US was going to go along with this. And that's always the problem with these so-called offers, right? Because it's all right for one person to say, we can make this offer, but you've got to persuade the other members of the Security Council. I'm not actually 100% sure of how you would get a new permanent member, but I guess it means a revision of the Charter, which probably means everyone in the Security Council or even the General Assembly, I'm not quite sure, have to then vote to agree this. That's very difficult to achieve. The UN rarely gets unanimity on anything. Anyway, the main difference is that this was a sixth seat that was proposed. So adding India alongside, well, of course, it was the Republic of China, then, but with a view to. And I think Nehru first of all, on the Soviet side, this is part of the general kind of peace offensive, peaceful coexistence talk of the kind of the post-Stalin era, before things kind of got tense again in the Cold War towards the end of the 50s and early 60s. And India had been doing a wonderful job. Some of the Soviets, is it Menon, KPS Menon? No, he'd already moved on. I forget who was the ambassador in India, roughly in the Soviet Union in 1955. But a letter came back from them talking about the Soviet leaders suggesting that the Cold War was over at this point. There was this great moderation and engagement with India and others of these newly independent states in Asia and, those on the cusp of being so, I guess, in Africa as well. And China in particular, joining a bit more the international community. It's there at the Geneva conference. It's there at Bandung, very much due to Indian kind of sponsorship. And so the Soviets kind of are probing in this way. By this stage, the Indians are really assisting Moscow with this sort of peaceful coexistence agenda. And so it's part of that context. But yeah, again, Nehru didn't really see this as possible. And in the exchange with Bulganin, again, he makes this point, which he always does, that yes, India deserves that. It should be at some point, but he makes the point that, we've got a lot to sort out before we can get there. And really, again, it's about China, this sorting out the China issue first.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it makes me wonder, what do you sort of think, apart from all the hate that is driven towards Nehru that we both do not agree with, what do you think is the legacy of sort of these two offers that were not approaches, suggestions that were made to India in the 1950s?
Just to underline that this wasn't really an offer, what I've just done, I've just got the kind of exchange between Bulganin and Nehru. I mean, Bulganin sort of, after Nehru says it's really not the time, Bulganin says, yes, we only raise this to get your views, but we agree it's not the time and we have to wait for the right moment. We agree things should be taken one by one, and the things in front of this issue of India having a seat was very much, China. So I think A.G. Noorani, who wrote about this, says it was less than an offer. It's not a real offer. It's, but what is the legacy of this all for today? Well, I think it adds to this. It's just another means of bashing Nehru's legacy, bashing his kind of a nail in his coffin in the kind of eyes of those who think he was some sort of, demon or whatever. It's unfortunate because it's a misunderstanding that these were, I think we use the term offer and we shouldn't, because they weren't real offers. These were not real offers. That, it's like if I say I can give you would you be interested if I gave you £1 million? It's not in my, but if I was to offer you the crown jewels, the British crown jewels, I might be asking you just to see whether you're someone who's interested in acquiring them. But it's not in my power to offer it. And, I think often these so-called offers were made as a way of expressing a desire on the part of the US in 1950 and the Soviets in 1955, as a way of showing we like you, we want to do more business with you kind of thing. So it's part of that kind of desire to get warmer relations. So I don't know, when you think of the legacy of this, it drives people in India crazy, or some people in India crazy that this happened. That's one legacy. I'm not sure how much more of a legacy there is, because it's not as if these were real, if Nehru had actually had a gift-wrapped seat at the council and had turned it down, then we might say, oh, that has a big legacy because the UN Security Council has underrepresented, for instance, Asian interests over decades. Okay, and that might be true, that the UN Security Council has failed Asia in all sorts of ways, and Africa and other parts of the world. But it's not really a legacy of these turned down offers, because they weren't real offers. So there's that. Yeah, I think it all gets tied up with this sense of outrage and betrayal around the 62 war as well. This idea that India offered, great friendship to China. We did all sorts of things for China. This support for its seat at the UN being perhaps the biggest instance of that. And, for all that we suffered and sacrificed, we sacrificed a seat on the Security Council. And then we got this awful war in 62. So I think it adds to that mix of betrayal and outrage and continuing kind of shame about that war. In terms of a wider legacy, I don't really, I think this is an Indian issue. I don't really think it's something that within Indian culture and politics today, this is perhaps something that is more relevant. I don't really see that it has particular global resonance. Even for China, I don't even know whether the Chinese were kind of aware of this in the 1950s, that these very sort of tentative probings had been made of India and what about the UN seat for India. And there's a general kind of asymmetry in Chinese today, in contemporary China and India, about the history of Sino-Indian relations, in that it's just obsessed over far more in India than it is in China. And obviously India's the one that suffered a defeat, in 62. So of course that's going to rankle, and perhaps in some quarters there's a sense of there being unfinished business there. So when you get the current border confrontations that we've seen this year and in the last few years, there might be people in India who think in those sorts of terms of, right, so it could be an opportunity to settle scores. In China, in a popular level, people do not think much about this at all. There's probably very little knowledge broadly of the conflict with India back in the 60s. And probably, and that's unfortunate also, there's little knowledge of the support that India gave to China at the UN. That is unfortunate, because that was something that was a sustained and serious policy. which speaks to, a desire to recognize China's contribution to international politics. That legacy should be better known in China, I would say. But unfortunately isn't. The Chinese tend to look more in terms of international politics to the US, right? That's who they aspire to compete with. And let's be honest, now they do, right? They've got to that kind of position of really, so they're far less concerned at a popular and an elite level with what's going on in India and how the Indians think of China.
Yeah, I mean, I think because India aspires to compete with China, it obsesses a lot about China, whereas China aspires to compete with the US, and therefore it obsesses with the US. And even when I was there were very few people in China who cared about India or who knew anything about India for that matter, even. Whereas over here, like, China occupies a large amount of our mind space, which I think is unfortunate on many counts. But
that goes back to history. Sorry, but this asymmetry, or rather, let's say this, asymmetry, or this attitude of the Chinese, perhaps intellectual elite towards India. If you go back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the kind of the nascent, anti-colonial intellectuals that you got, whether anti-colonial intellectual is quite the right word actually in the Chinese context, because they weren't colonized, but they were suffering from imperial pressure and, the concessions, the treaty ports, all of that. But you got figures like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao looking at the predicament that China was in, subject to a great deal of a loss of sovereignty, and looking around the world and considering the way in which Western power was working in other parts of the world, and trying to figure out what can China do, what lessons can we draw on. Where they didn't think they had anything to learn from was India. They dismissed India entirely as a failure, right? It had, unfairly, of course, but that was anyway the view they tended to take, that India had failed to resist imperialism. Unlike China, we've at least kept the wolf just at the door rather than kind of coming in and setting up house. But so there is this long-standing kind of sense, perhaps inequality in the way that Chinese and Indian kind of nationalist intellectuals have looked at each other, because the Indians definitely tended to look more admiringly towards Chinese national movements in the 20th century.
And I think that's something that's set to continue, the Indian obsession with China. And I don't know what to make of it, but as a China scholar myself, I'm just going to hope that the pool grows.
It keeps us all busy.
And sometimes tries to put food on the table. So I think that's what matters. This is my last question for you, Anton. What books or resources would you recommend for people who are interested more in this period of history or about Sino-Indian relations?
We mentioned, and I think you've already done a talk with him, but if you say Sino-Indian relations, to get quite a different kind of sense of this, one that goes beyond the sort of diplomacy and all that territorial stuff, do go and have a look at Ghosh's book, Arunabh Ghosh, his book on, I forget the name, Making It Count, right? About statistics in 1950s PRC, and he does a lot on India in that. So that's a way of just kind of, if you're a bit bored with some of the territorial and high policy stuff, then, go and have a look at that. I think it's quite worth putting this into a broader context of the Cold War, and what was going on in India and how India viewed in this period the Cold War. And there's a lot, being written on this at the moment. I mean, I think a good book, an interesting book to get a sense of what Nehru was about is Manu Bhagavan's The Peacekeepers. He also has a book, an edited volume on India in the Cold War with a whole array of kind of art, including myself. I have a chapter in his one, but lots of different perspectives on India in the Cold War. Zorawar Dowlat Singh wrote an interesting book, Power and Diplomacy, I think it is, which compares the Nehru period with Indira Gandhi, really interestingly, to try and get a sense of, if you're sitting listening to this and you're baffled by, Nehru's apparently, sacrificing Indian interests, go and look at that. It's a good way of kind of getting a grip on some of the logic of this. I mentioned Nabarun Roy wrote an article kind of responding to my own specific article looking at this UN seat issue. So otherwise, the Cold War in South Asia, Paul McGarr, Srinath Raghavan has written, he's of course a wonderful historian, international historian of India, and he wrote, what is it, War and Peace in Nehru's India or Modern India, but besides other things, but he's written, looking at sort of certain crises points in the Nehru period, including with China. So these sorts of things, there's a great deal to read. Yeah. And I'm, of course, working on my book. So at some point, my thesis will be turned into a book on kind of Sino-Indian relations throughout this period. And I am hoping to address, I am interested, of course, in the elite politics, as you can tell from our discussion. So I will be addressing all of that. But I'm trying to integrate that with looking more at people to people and transnational aspects as well. So keep your eyes open. It's not near the bookshelves yet, but at some point in the future, there may be a book by me as well, which you can go and look for.
Oh, yes, I'm really looking forward to that. And if that happens, we'll get you back and we'll continue this discussion, because clearly we could have talked for a lot longer. But yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Anton. Thank you for agreeing to come on the show and for your amazing insights.
Thank you very much, Hamseen. It was a great treat to come on. I enjoyed it very much.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached Anton's recommendations in the episode bio as usual, so do check those out. If you have questions or comments about today's episode or about global affairs or foreign policy in general, then you can send them across to us. On next week's episode, I'll answer listener questions about international relations. You can email me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram at States of Anarchy or on Twitter at HamsiniH. If you want to show us some love, send this episode to someone who you think may enjoy it. You can also leave us a rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app or website, but wherever you get your podcast from. We'll be back next week.
What are some of the radical changes that are now shaping our workspace? With physical distancing and heightened safety protocols being the norm, will technology finally make its large-scale entry to the workspace? Will design as we know it change for the long term? Is it possible for the Indian commercial real estate space to adopt a 360-degree approach to sustainability? Join our hosts at the Future of Space podcast by RMZ as we deliberate with industry leaders, analysts, and bright young minds on the way forward for the workspace given the new COVID normal. Tune in to the IVM Podcasts app or wherever you stream your favorite podcasts.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.